Okay, well, hello. Welcome everyone to the Digital Badges Interest Group Spring Forum. Today we are happy to welcome two presenters from Rutgers University who will be sharing a framework with us for assessing the quality of micro-credentials. And this presentation will be recorded and posted to the DBIG webpage, which I can post into the chat. And there will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Tori will be moderating that, so if you want to type any questions you have into the chat throughout the presentation, we will be relaying those to the presenters at the end. So we are going to leave some time for Q&A. So a little bit about this group. We are your DBIG co-conveners. I am Kelsey O'Brien, and I co-convene this group with Tori Raish and Emily Rimland. And the main thing that we do with this group is we offer these presentations. Usually we do two throughout the year. We do a fall and a spring forum. We offer all different types of topics related to digital badges. We are focused on libraries, and we're really interested in the ways that badges intersect with libraries and information literacy. But a lot of our presentations are really relevant to anyone who's interested in learning more about digital badges or implementing their own programs. So we welcome you to follow us and connect with us. You can subscribe to our listserv. We send out informational emails. We have a bibliography that we've been updating with literature on digital badges. You can also check out our website, which is a LibGuide. We have all sorts of resources on there. If you're interested in sharing your experiences, we have a series of blog posts that we've been putting together, all sorts of things that you can check out. So we invite you to do that. And we're happy to have our speakers with us here today that are going to get started in just a minute. I want to tell you a little bit about them first. Michelle is the Associate Director of the Education and Employment Research Center at the School of Management and Labor Relations. And Michelle Van Noy conducts research on higher education and workforce development. Her research focuses on several key areas: how colleges organize their programs and provide instruction to prepare students for work, how students make choices about majors and careers, and how employers use credentials in the hiring process. She has particular expertise in community college workforce programs, including non-credit programs and technician education. And she also has experience conducting large-scale national evaluations in education and workforce development from her previous work at Mathematica Policy Research. Heather McKay is the director of the Education and Employment Research Center at the School of Management and Labor Relations. And in this capacity, Heather conducts research and evaluations on community college programs, state and federal workforce development systems, and education and workforce policies. Currently, she is conducting research on 2 U.S. Department of Education First in the World grants. And Heather's research interests include state and federal workforce development systems, skills systems, college completion, workplace literacy, and innovative and technology-based training programs. So thank you to Michelle and Heather for joining us today. And I'm going to pass the mic to Michelle if you'd like to start sharing your screen at any time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kelsey. Let me just try and get my slides up here. Okay, so thanks again for the chance to share with you some of this work that we've done on quality and how to assess quality for non-degree credentials, and in this case, particularly thinking about micro-credentials. You know, we started off this work being asked to sort of write what is known about quality for non-degree credentials. And I think what we realized is that, you know, as we started looking at the literature, you know, to assess what quality, you know, what we know about quality, we realized that nobody has actually even defined quality well. So that's, we sort of ended up making this framework. But, you know, why were we interested to begin with? I mean, so we look at sort of the rise of non-degree credentials like micro-credentials, and, you know, we see a rapidly changing labor market, which is really fueling the need for people to kind of upskill and better mark their skills, increasing need for sort of lifelong learning and, just-in-time training that's, really specific and relevant to particular skill needs. And as a result of that, we saw sort of there's a huge proliferation of different kinds of non-degree credentials in the world, which, offers both opportunity for people to pursue credentials that are very relevant to their skill needs and interests, but also some potential concerns and issues around confusion and variation across the quality of the credentials that are available. But we see that certainly this is the increasing incidence of non-degree credentials is certainly shown in the data. The National Center for Education Statistics has recently begun measuring how many adults have non-degree credentials, and as of 2016, over 1/4 of adults have some kind of non-degree credential. And what do we mean by non-degree credentials? We should sort of step back and even say what we're talking about. And I know that today we're focused on a more particular aspect of this, but we, as we wrote for our paper, we were looking very broadly at this full landscape of non-degree credentials, which in some cases includes sub-baccalaureate credit certificates. So short-term trainings, usually 1 year or less. It also includes non-credit certificates that are often offered by colleges or universities for completion of a non-credit program. We included apprenticeship in this case as well, industry certification, so credentials that an industry body awards for demonstration of a particular skill, and also occupational professional licensure, which are awarded by governmental agencies for demonstration of skill. And then of course, I think the very interesting area that we're talking about today is really the huge increase in interest in badges and micro-credentials, which we see a lot of different variation, and these things are very interesting as they're kind of emerging and evolving. Is what do they mean, right? So credentials that are awarded for short-term programs of study or demonstrated set of skills. So we include many different things. And, I think it'll be really interesting to hear from you all in the Q&A today, some of the things that you're thinking about and doing and some of the questions that are coming up through your work in this area, because I think it's, it's certainly something we've spent a lot of time thinking about, but I think we're also still very much learning, and I think we'll be interested in learning from you all in terms of your thoughts and questions, in this area, this interesting emerging area. So what do we know about non-degree credentials more broadly? I think that, the big bottom line story here is that there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of things going on here. We know there's thousands of non-degree credentials, literally thousands of them. They're awarded by a wide range of organizations, it can be colleges, industry groups, government, unions. They're offered based on a variety of criteria. Some might just be for completing an educational program. Others, are for competency measured through exams. And this can occur, learning can occur in many different places, at school, and some of it can be learning that occurs more informally and is measured later by an exam. And then, one of the things we clearly know is that there's not a lot of data available. It's located in many different sources, but it's pretty hard to find any centralized location for any data. One thing that's interesting about non-degree credentials, though, is that they can even intersect across each other. So on the prior slide, I'm talking about all the different kinds of non-degree credentials. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that we can see that sometimes they occur together. So you might have a certificate that also includes an industry certification, or a degree that also includes badges. So there's also overlap, which is another interesting thing that factors into this discussion. But I think what this shows, all this variation, all these non-degree credentials, all the different providers and just everything, is that, we sort of say it's kind of like the Wild West. There's not really good definitions sometimes even of what we're talking about, particularly around micro-credentials and badges. And so, basically even just defining what they are is often difficult in terms of coming up with a common language and understanding, let alone trying to understand what quality is, and that's very difficult. So there's just really no single system or set of standards, or even the language oftentimes, to think about what quality is and how we begin to approach measuring it. And we also know that, like many of these other things, the quality definition might vary based on where somebody's located, what the industry is that they're working in, and many other things. So we sort of put that out there just to say that, this is an area that really needs a lot of attention to try and make sense of what's going on. And, there were some issues that we just baseline sort of took hold of to look at when we think about what is a quality non-degree credential. And so recognizing that, a definition of quality might vary depending on who we're talking about. Is it the credential holder or is it the employer who's hiring them? They may actually have different needs that hopefully sometimes are aligned, but sometimes can be in tension with each other. Likewise with a educational institution that's offering a credential and policymakers who might be supporting them by funding or policy. So, I think that one of the things that we do want to keep in mind here throughout all of this discussion is to keep front and center the issue of equity and making sure that, that's really the bottom line issue about why quality is so important, is to make sure that when credentials are being offered, people are investing time and resources to make sure that they are quality and lead to the outcomes that they're promising, that they actually do lead to the outcomes they promise, and not offer false claims on where they will go. Particularly for people who are seeking short-term credentials, who are maybe investing a lot of time and money for them to achieve a certain goal. And so there's a real obligation to make sure that those promises are delivered. And so what we hoped for with this framework was to put this out there as a guide to sort of spur conversation and think about it as a very broad conception of what quality is and how that can be implemented in measurement depending on the institution and the goals of the credential. And so I will walk through some of those key elements of credential quality, and we can talk more about these later. But as we saw it, sort of looking at a credential, there are a few different elements that are essentially important to look at. One is just the overall design of the credential. So what features of the credential, as it's designed by the grantor, define it, in terms of what the credential does, how it seeks to do it, how it's awarded, all of the things that are sort of set up when making a credential. What is the design of the credential? Now, beyond sort of the actual intention of how the credential is designed and set up, there are also the outcomes of it in terms of the competencies that those who gain the credential have. So what are the skills and knowledge that the credential holders who gain the credential actually come to hold at the end of it? And that might be different actually than the competencies that the credential was intended to convey. So in the design, we have competencies that are the credential intends to convey, but then we actually have, at the end of the day, the competencies that the credential holder actually has. Then there's a whole series of mechanisms that often aren't recognized when we're talking about credentials, but we think are particularly important here with non-degree credentials and with micro-credentials, is really the market processes are sort of a whole set of mechanisms that help us understand how a credential comes to be recognized and have currency, how it comes to be known, how it comes to be used. And then finally, there's a whole set of outcomes. These are really the promises that the credentials are making in terms of educational outcomes, employment and earnings, and other social outcomes that individuals may gain, as well as employers and society more broadly. So I'll talk through each of these elements a little bit more to give you a sense of some of the ways that we conceptualize these ideas and how they may be translated into practice. So this is just a nice a picture sort of depicting this model. So going from the top of credential design down to the competencies that the credential holder might hold, then taking those competencies and the well-designed credential, we want to make sure that there's market processes that actually effectively make sure the credential is known and used in the world. And then there's sort of the final set of outcomes that we hope a credential would convey. So all of this is available actually on our website. So if you want to pull up this model at a later date, we have an executive summary that's on our EERC, Rutgers EERC website that shows this, and you can take a look at this as well as our longer report. And at the end of the slides, we also have some links to get to that information. But I'll run through each of these 4 elements. So first is credential design. And as I said, one of the important things is really looking at the competencies that the credential is designed to mark, and really seeing, are those competencies relevant to the goal of the credential, to what it's supposed to do for the individual or for the employer in general. So do we have the right competencies embedded in the credential? The second thing to take a look at is, are the instructional processes associated with the credential appropriate? Are they actually effective in helping the learner gain the skills, the competencies that the credential seeks to mark? Assessment processes are very important, particularly for credentials that do have a test based on them. And so really looking at whether those assessment processes are fair and effective initially to award the credential, and whether there are ongoing assessment processes that need to be completed in order to maintain the credential. Stackability and portability are things we think about a lot too, especially as we're thinking about shorter term credentials. Do they interlock with each other? Can somebody take a series of smaller credentials and build them up into something bigger, into something that would lead to a longer term credential to a degree? And are they transferable across different locations, across different organizations? So, how really do they share and do they build? And that's really, very much a part of sort of the initial design and setup of a credential. Transparency is also another really important issue here around credential design, sort of how well the credentials goals are conveyed to the wider world. So is it clear what the credential is supposed to mark and how it works? Is that information available? Is that understandable? And then finally, it's very important that we think about the design of the credential in terms of whether it is accessible to a broad range of people, whether it's affordable. Many non-degree credentials don't sort of have the affordability built into them if they're not part of programs that are covered by financial aid or other sorts of funding systems. So thinking about that is another important issue. Competencies, as I said, are very important in terms of, does the credential holder actually come away with the skills, the knowledge that the credential is intended to convey? So this is really an outcome of whether all of those other design features of the credential were done effectively. Does the person actually learn effectively? Are they assessed effectively? And do they have the right skills for what the credential is intending to mark that they have? Assessment here can be pretty difficult to actually know whether somebody has the right competencies, but this is ultimately what we care about. We want credentials to mean something and to be, real true markers of a set of skills. So this is the next piece I was talking about, is sort of the market processes. So what does this mean? This is sort of how the credential itself is come to be known and recognized. So there are a few different ways that this is, can happen. There are some large-scale transparency initiatives in the realm of credentialing, like the Credential Engine, for example, at the national level, which is seeking to just make more information available about credentials and convey that more clearly. And so that's a real way just to get information out about individual credentials. But then there are other ways where information on credentials can be conveyed into the world in different ways. And so one often is the actual credential grantor is known in a particular area. So a university or a college has a reputation, and because of that, there becomes awareness of their credentials that just come along with the sort of the reputation of the grantor. Along those lines, certain groups can sometimes give endorsements or validations of a credential, which will then also kind of raise and elevate its value and its a recognition within a field. Regulation oftentimes, is something that will, clearly make a credential be needed to be used, but that is a process that, that certain credentials go through to have them become part of, a regulatory requirement for a particular occupation in an industry. And then we look at actually what organizations do. So organizations have to make choices about whether or not to use credentials. And so employers, may decide that a particular credential is important in their hiring practice. And these often are reflected in practices and policies. So once they begin to know a credential, do they use it in their hiring? And so that's, that comes down to a set of organizational choices. And likewise, educational institutions can also choose whether or not to recognize learning gained through other credentials, through, prior learning policies and such things. So I think, we, want to recognize that there are sort of these internal mechanisms that will take a credential that may be very high quality with credential holders that have the skills and competencies they're intended to mark, but then there are a set of processes that can then occur to make that credential be known and valued in the wider world, leading to the outcomes of value that we hope to see with credential holders. So we seek to see, do individuals have economic outcomes, positive economic outcomes? Are they more likely to get a job because they hold a certain credential or have higher earnings? Likewise, educationally, are they more likely to complete a program of study? Are they more likely to continue on? Social outcomes, are they more effective citizens? Are they better parents? Things like this, are also important outcomes of credentials. And we also recognize that employers, certainly have a vested interest in the outcomes of credentials. They want to, we want to see, whether there's better retention, easier recruitment, higher levels of productivity. So there's a lot of things that can happen and can be looked at the level of the employer. And finally, there's, of course, societal level outcomes, more informed citizenry, better civic engagement, a whole host of outcomes that can also be looked at that way. So there's a very wide range of outcomes if we really think of, if we really wanted to measure all the ways in which credentials lead to outcomes, there are many different ways we could think about doing that. So those are sort of the overall kind of sets of issues within the framework that we looked at in terms of thinking about quality. If we had all the data available to us, since we have very little, we figured if we had all the data available to us, what would we want to look at? And those were the sort of ideas in terms of the elements of quality. And of course, there's some really important implications for policy and practice that we need to take away from this model. In terms of what do we do, right? So we, first of all, given the confusion and variation in the non-degree credential world, we want to create better awareness of what non-degree credentials are, what micro-credentials are. So what does this issue of quality mean and how do we measure it? We, of course, need better data. As I mentioned, there's very little data. It's all over the place. And we further need systems that are set up in place to begin to assess quality. So what can universities do as more and more move into incorporating micro-credentials and badges and certifications into their programs of study? What systems do we have in place to think about quality? And that's where we hope our framework can help inform those as institutions begin to think about what quality is. Take a look at a holistic view of what quality is if you can measure all of these things. And, also to kind of create ongoing ways to use data. And certainly we're seeing different efforts at a lot of different realms in terms of states and institutions who are thinking about quality measures. So we see, educational institutions are doing things with prior learning, competency-based learning. There's a credential framework to think about how we measure quality, and other efforts that sort of more directly target institutions. We see efforts at the state level in terms of setting quality standards, and through certain programs like WIOA, there's a list that will indicate quality credentials, and also efforts to begin to integrate some of these issues into statewide data systems. And then there's certainly national efforts, as I mentioned, the credential engine, trying to better map all the credentials available and provide more information on them. And then some other emergent systems that are trying to develop standards for certificate programs, such as some of the efforts of ANSI and others. And then we're also, I think, seeing some interesting discussions occurring within the accreditation agencies about what to think about these new emergent non-degree credentials and how do they fit in into accreditation policies and whatnot. So I think there's a lot of discussions around these existing systems that are interesting and ongoing. So that's sort of an overview of the kind of the broad framework. I'm going to turn things over now to Heather to talk more specifically about how we think about applying this framework that I've just laid out, specifically in the realm of digital credentials. So I'll let Heather take over from here.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about how this framework can be thought about in terms of digital credentials, how it might be able to be used, and kind of the work that that we were using to bolster this and to better understand how the framework might be used for digital credentials is some work that we did in the state of Colorado under the TACT grants, which were a Department of Labor grant program. They're called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College Training Grant Program. It was about $200 billion that went out into community colleges. And one of the pieces of this was that colleges were incentivized to develop digital credentials like badges. And so we have a case in Colorado where a badging program was developed and used. And so that's one of the ways that I am understanding how the framework can be used for digital credentials, including some other work we've done. But I'll be really interested to hear from all of you as to how you think this can be used in the work that you're doing, and relating this more to libraries as we move forward and think about the different ways that the framework can be useful as you create and consume credentials. So today, I think really the goal is to understand how credentials can better be understood, developed, implemented, and used, these digital credentials. And so, Michelle, if you could jump to the next slide.
Sorry.
That's okay, no problem. So,
oh, jeez, I'm so sorry. I'm just gonna have to scroll through. I'm sorry. We'll get.
That's totally fine. I can just.
I don't know what I did. Okay,
it's just a picture of a digital badge. So just something probably all of you have seen before, a picture of a digital badge. This is one of the badges that was developed through that Colorado Community College System program. And it's an example of a badge that was posted on the Credly format. And so what we know about badging and digital credentials in higher education is that they're becoming more and more popular. Academic institutions are creating digital badges. All different kinds of academic institutions are creating digital badges, 4-year institutions and 2-year institutions, as is the case with this credential you see in front of you. And I've read a variety of different stats about how many institutions are doing this, but a recent article in Forbes said that 1 in 5 higher education institutions are creating some kind of digital badging program or talking about some kind of digital badging program. But I would gather that it's probably higher. Here at Rutgers, there are discussions around this within the university in many departments, and obviously many of you are from higher education institutions thinking about these ideas and maybe implementing them. So the question, of course, is to what end? Why would we do this? Is there a benefit to students who earn badges or micro-credentials? Are they providing value to students as they move through their educational pathways or on their future career paths? And so one of the things that I think the framework can be useful for is thinking through these ideas. And at higher education institutions, the framework could be a useful tool to walk through to make sure that these kinds of goals are being met and also that high quality credentials are being created. Many institutions are also using digital credentials to kind of address these problems that we've had in terms of criticism about skills gaps that students have when they're coming out. So badges are in some ways nice, clear ways to give students the skills we think or know employers might want as they move forward. Michelle, could you move to the next slide? So this list that Michelle just threw up here is a list of all of the badges, or a good chunk of the badges that were created through this Colorado digital badging program that I spoke to you about. And we concluded this study a few years ago. And one of the focus points here was to create digital badges for manufacturing. But digital badges were also created across the curriculum. You'll see a lot of digital badges here in math and some in other areas as well. And so one of the points here is that digital badges can really be used for almost any skill in a curriculum. So we've got here a digital badge for systems of equation skills. We've got a graphing skills badge. And so these discrete mathematics skills were turned into badges in the state of Colorado. And that's quite interesting, right? Because we can think of the use of digital badges in higher education across many different departments for many different skills, and as a tool for both faculty, learners, and maybe employers to better understand the kinds of skills that students are getting in higher education. And so there's sort of a unique role here. And I think the Colorado program that we looked at was a nice example of this. The goal in the Colorado program was for badging to be used as a way for students to really learn and document skills that they were getting along a pathway for learning. So in this program, and as I think at many educational institutions and institutions of higher education, badges were not the end all, right? They were a point along a pathway. But I think some of the work that we've done and some of the work that we did in this project did show that there were people who came just for the skills that maybe a badge could capture. There's a scholar that we work with at the center named Peter Barr at the University of Michigan, and he studies this idea of skills builders. And that was really many of the people who were a part of this grant program that we looked at. So as we think about the different kinds of students in higher education, we think about adult students, displaced workers, which we might be thinking about more and more in the COVID crisis, right? People coming back to get something so they can go back to work. Badges might be a nice way to fill some of those needs. And this program in Colorado was exactly that. This grant program was a response to the 2008 financial crisis. And so many people were coming back to get these discrete skills and then go right back into the workforce. And so the badging program offered a way to do that for folks. It was tied to larger credentials. So in many of the colleges, the badges were points along a pathway to a larger certificate or degree. But they could be done on their own or available to just teach someone a skill set, which is kind of an interesting feature here that I think is important, certainly, and timely in the moment that we're at right now. The badges in the Colorado program, as I said, were posted on Credly, and students were also advised to post them on their LinkedIn page. In the creation of the badges, this was not something that higher education institutions did alone. They were using industry partners to build those badges. Committees were put together to do the work, which involved faculty members. In some cases, it involved students, and in all cases, it involved industry. But at the end of the day, some of the questions that we heard, which is where I think the framework comes into play here, is that we heard, still, I don't understand the value of this from students, from faculty, from employers. I'm not really aware of how I access this or how someone sees it or how I talk about it to people. And so there are a lot of questions here that exist with digital badges that I think the framework can be helpful for. And so I'm going to make some suggestions on how this could be used that emerged out of this research that we did in Colorado. So if you could go to the next slide. So when we think about the framework for quality, as Michelle said, we're thinking about a variety of different parts of both putting together a credential and using it in the world. And so one of the theories around badges is that it really provides a more granular and tailored view of a student's skill set than a typical academic credential. And it can include measures of experience, competency, and quality in that. And so in thinking about developing digital credentials, we can begin to think about the use and also the difference from other types of non-degree credentials or typical degree credentials that we offer in higher education, that these can really be about discrete skill sets and do something very different from what we typically offer. Others in the field also argue that badges can act as a signifier of knowledge and skills that are valued, that they can be guideposts to learners as they plan and chart their educational and workforce paths. And they can also be mechanisms to help along in the learning process. So providing an opportunity for a skills-based learning and then getting a credential for it, a badge or a micro-credential for that. Additionally, the research shows that badges can serve as milestones and momentum points for students, increasing motivation and possibly even increasing retention for them. So there are lots of reasons why higher ed might want to join into this path. But like all credentials, badges need to be linked to rigor. And that rigor needs to be assessed with evidence and put together in many of the ways that Michelle talked about. So all of those components of quality need to be part of the making of a badge as well. So the badge needs to really make sure that it's validating competencies. And the badge also needs to be able to be portable, be able to be transparent in terms of what students are learning. In some places, and in the Colorado example, one thing that was really valuable about the badges that they created in manufacturing was that students were able to bring an artifact along with their badge. So not only did they have the digital badge, but they also had this thing that they had created on a lathe or a mill in a classroom setting. And so they could walk along and move and show that they had these skills. But it's a little bit more difficult when the skill is something intangible and harder to show in terms of a competency like problem solving, et cetera. So thinking about how to put together a badge so that it's clear to students what they're getting and it's also clear to others what that credential means, I think is important as we all begin to move forward in the creation and use of badges. Stackability is another piece that's essential here. This was a really important piece of the Colorado example. All of the badges stacked into larger certificates so students could come in and out earning the badges, but they always had value. I think the one problem though was that the badges only had value at that institution. Or within the Colorado system, sorry, not just at a single institution. Within the Colorado system, students could move along a pathway with those badges, but they didn't really have value outside of the state of Colorado. So if somebody moved to Utah or Wyoming, they wouldn't be able to use the badge moving forward. And so there were some challenges there. Now, one way to deal with this is something that Michelle spoke about earlier, which is to use something like credit for prior learning, which could play an important role in this. But of course, that requires recognition, and it requires making sure that there's a great deal of transparency in that. And it might also require a higher education institution being able to equate a badge to credit. Is there an alignment there that could happen over time? And that may be possible for some badges, but not all. If badges are embedded in classes, then it might be easier to tell the tale of what the meaning is of that badge. And then the final piece, of course, here is, are badges relevant to industry needs? And depending on where the badges are being created and what departments they're being created for, I think that this could vary tremendously. But hopefully, the badges have value to students in their educational pathways and in their career pathways. And so if we're using badges, as some theorists and academics talk about, in terms of bridging skill gaps, then this alignment to industry needs is very, very important. Michelle, if you could move on to the next slide. So I think in terms of market processes, digital badges have really great potential here because they do talk about a discrete skill. So it's a really nice way for both a student to understand the skill that they have and talk to others in the world about it. And it also, in theory, it's a really nice way for an employer to understand if a student or a potential employee has the skills that they want. So has those critical thinking skills, those problem solving skills. If they have a badge associated with them, it might be easier to begin to equate these two things. But they're also, as Michelle talked about, that wild, wild west term. If non-degree credentials are the Wild West, badges are sort of even more amorphous to many folks. In the Colorado example, we had people who were like, a badge? What? There's something on a LinkedIn page? I don't even have a LinkedIn page. And so depending on the kind of industry that folks are in, these may or may not be something that employers are aware of. They may or may not be something that students know how to use. And so we may, at higher education institutions, not be able to do as much in sort of informing employers, although we certainly should do our part in putting it out and making sure that they know where it's from. So the institution that it's from, as Michelle talked about in those market processes, can make a difference in people understanding its value. Also making sure that people understand what it's made up of. But I think one of the best things that we could probably do in higher education institutions is make sure that students understand the value of badges and make sure that they leave the doors of institutions knowing how to talk about the badges that they have and the skills associated with those badges to inform employers and inform those who they're talking to about the things that they learned while they were in a 4-year or 2-year institution. So I think there's some really interesting possibilities there in terms of communication. The other pieces here that might be crucial in terms of thinking about market processes and badges is to create awareness of the badges among employer communities, to create awareness of the badges among other academic communities, so departments at other institutions where students might be going or talking to folks. If I think about Rutgers, I think about maybe our local businesses. So if the pharmaceutical industry in New Jersey was aware of some of the badges that our pharmacy department was offering, that could be incredibly helpful to students as they move forward. So making sure to get that information out in the world. Of course, another thing that's really useful that Michelle talked about as well is this idea of endorsement. And could badges created by higher education institutions be endorsed by industry? And in some cases, this is happening, but certainly there's great value there. Pathways, again, are important, and this idea of employers being interested in them, hiring folks based on it, retaining folks based on it, and promoting folks. So sending their own employees to maybe get a badge, get a discrete skill, come to the 4-year institution or the 2-year institution, get that skill and go back into the workforce to use it. And then, of course, there's the future of how we document this. So right now, there are different portals that you could post a badge to. You might be able to connect badges to LinkedIn profiles. Students might be able to put badges in their resume, but could something be included in transcripts in the future and comprehensive learner records to make sure that this learning gets moved and continues along with the student as they go. So these badges become a part of building a pathway in education and hopefully also building a pathway in the workforce. Michelle, can you move to the next slide? So I think outcomes are the place where we probably have the most difficulty with badges going forward. These are credentials that we know very little about. We don't know how many micro-credentials are out in the world. We don't know who's offering them. We don't know what people have them for or are using them for. It's just this wide array of many, many questions. And of course, there's very little data on them. So there's very little data in student information systems at our own higher education institutions. And then when we go out into the labor market, we know little except maybe from surveys as to who has micro-credentials, who has badges, and how many badges they have, and how have they used them, or what are they using them for. So one way to begin to collect this would be to look at employer data and find out how they're using it, how they're interested about it, if it's a part of their hiring. So doing surveys with employers in the future might be a really important way to collect this. Another thing would be, do institutions or could institutions begin to add markers of these badges and credentials and earning these different documents into their student information system, so that we could chart a pathway in terms of momentum and movement forward, in terms of educational pathways, and then maybe in terms of labor market attainment later on, in places where there are things like state longitudinal data systems where we can track students from K-12 into the workforce. Of course, there are other outcomes that people have surmised, people have done surveys about. There's lots of research on these milestone momentum point ideas. Could badges and micro-credentials be useful in helping us to retain students having trouble, giving them points to celebrate, helping them to move forward and continue on? The other piece here is the lifelong learning piece. I mentioned earlier that for the Colorado project, these badges and micro-credentials were particularly useful for older learners who had been displaced. I think right now, during the COVID crisis, is a nice time to find out what kind of value do badges and micro-credentials have in terms of lifelong learning and getting people back to work. Can these tools, these short-term credentials, be useful in some way for folks? And then, of course, there are some trends happening in the world right now that I think badges and micro-credentials really align nicely to. One of those ideas is skills-based hiring, so hiring people based on the skills that they have rather than the credentials that they have. While badges are a credential, they offer people a really nice way to talk about their skills, as we discussed before. And so this allows them to maybe be further along on a path for a skills-based hiring platform that might be asking them to list their skills on a resume in a very clear way, rather than paying attention to those credentials. Another piece here is economic development. Could badges and micro-credentials be useful as businesses come into different places? So obviously businesses come in thinking about how many people have degrees, or how many people are working in the automotive industry, or different kinds of skill sets that employers are looking for. But of course, we read lots of newspaper articles and hear lots of stories about these problem-solving skills gaps and these critical thinking skills gaps. So could communities and towns and states begin to use this idea of badges and micro-credentials to say, hey, we're graduating a lot of people with 4-year degrees, but we're also graduating them with problem-solving credentials and critical thinking credentials and quantitative literacy credentials and other skills that employers might be looking for and need. So I think there's great potential here for policy in terms of badges and micro-credentials as we move forward. So I'm going to close there. Those are just some ideas that have emerged from our research into how this framework can be used for badges and micro-credentials. But I know all of your work is a little bit different, and we're really interested to hear how you are using this or thinking about using badges and micro-credentials in your libraries and in your higher education institutions, and how you see the framework as a tool. So Michelle, you can move to the last slide and we can move on to questions, I think.
Great. Thanks, Heather and Michelle. That was a great presentation. I think some questions came in while you were talking, so we can start with those, but anybody can use the chat to ask your questions as well, or leave some feedback or comments if you have related content to cover. So a question came up about learning more about content ownership and compensation. So something about the price models and who owns what, how quality is enforced. Has anyone else run into this issue, and how did you combat it? And that came from Randall.
So I'm just reading this question. So I think that maybe there are others on this webinar who could answer this question better than me, but I can talk about what happens in Colorado in terms of price models and who owns what. So Colorado developed the credentials, all the badges and credentials all themselves, and they charged a common price. And so the system owned the credentials. The credentials were developed out of programs that they had and added as stepping stones through that. And there was a common price across the system for these badges and digital credentials. And at some points, they were just included in programs that were already existing and a part of that package. Michelle, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that these are issues that I think are being thought through at a lot of institutions, you know, where there hasn't been sort of a system level policy. I don't know. I'd be really curious to hear what others are saying, because I've been engaged in some conversations with folks at the university who've been grappling with the question of, you know, whether these credentials, you know, do students pay for gaining one, or is it sort of part of what they're already doing within the university? You know, and I think the question of quality enforcement, I think, you know, in some ways, I guess the question is, you know, do we even have that for credentials more broadly, even more traditional credentials? I mean, we do have systems, you know, systems of review, we have accreditation, we have a lot of other systems, but, you know, how do you actually enforce it? I think that, you know, it's the same set of questions, you know, where we have sort of sets of standards that, you know, we try and enforce, but, you know, there's so much variation there. You know, and then there is a tension, I think, between getting too specific around defining what quality is versus letting people innovate and letting things emerge in this emerging area, you know, and not dampening that kind of creativity that's there. So I think there's a tension between creating broad guidelines and giving real specifics and enforcement. So I don't know, I'd be curious to see if others have any thoughts, or if there's more things coming up in the chat.
Yeah, Pat just chimed in the chat about establishing governance first is key for quality around microcredentials. So that looks to be the most relevant comment about quality.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, I think within universities, you know, there's no infrastructure. There is absolutely no infrastructure for dealing with this. And so, you know, some of the discussions I've been seeing, you know, is really, do we need to set up an office to handle the review of these credentials? And if we do that, how do we specify what that looks like and what they do? You know, and do we want to, how specific can we get right now about what those processes are? You know, can we create enough flexibility, again, to keep the creativity alive, but also to make sure that the quality is there? But that is a very good point, though, that there have to be structures. There have to be structures and systems. And I think that's where we were hoping to contribute to the conversation, was to give some fodder for setting up those systems, some general guidelines that then have to get worked out as people encounter, you know, specific issues and questions about implementation and the needs of students and other actors in this process going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge that I saw in the Colorado case, and I think a governance system would certainly be helpful for this. Obviously, the Colorado case moved forward under a grant, so the auspices were this grant program. But faculty buy-in was a real challenge in terms of both creating, offering, and moving these credentials forward. But then once the credentials were created, faculty buy-in was again a challenge in terms of accepting credentials from other places and accepting badges from other places and understanding their value. And I think this was an ongoing conversation that probably didn't get solved in the state and probably still hasn't. As far as I know, since we moved forward with the grants, the badges aren't used a tremendous amount. And I think that the badges aren't used a tremendous amount because the faculty buy-in just wasn't there. And certainly creating these kinds of structures, using something like the framework, creating a governance system would be helpful in moving that forward. And it would also give advocates to keep the ball rolling and make sure that there is both quality, but once the quality is there, there's also acceptance and awareness.
And part of it, I think, has to do with what the goal of the badge is. So if we think about it within a university context, there can be many different goals in creating a badge and having it used. I mean, part of it, you know, some of it is very internally facing for students, for student motivation, for students understanding and being able to articulate what they've learned, for helping students understand different pathways in terms of skill acquisition. So a lot of that stuff is very internal around motivation and self-knowledge for students, which is a slightly different goal, a very different goal than, you know, having it be a credential that marks a skill, you know, that an employer would recognize for hiring somebody that has sort of that kind of, that level of market currency, or that an educational institution would recognize for credit for prior learning. And so, you know, thinking about those things, I think that also affects what we think about in terms of quality and faculty buy-in. So I think, you know, some, you know, that sort of discussion of the buy-in, you know, if it's more about motivation, in some ways that, you know, that's maybe that's an easier place to start, a sensible place to start.
Great, thanks. I think that's helpful for people thinking about quality. At Penn State, we've kicked around the idea of setting up some sort of review. So for us, quality also, you have to bring branding into the conversation. If you're going to assign a certain level of quality to the badge or to a micro-credential, you have to think about how it's branded. So we kicked around the idea of creating a peer review committee, not necessarily subject matter experts, but about what micro-credentials can look like and what a quality micro-credential does look like. So people with that expertise. It never actually, so far it hasn't actually gone anywhere. Probably a lot of other people feel like this too, but at Penn State, it's not like we have dedicated an office to this, reassign people's responsibilities. Everyone's just doing it on top of the stuff that they've already been doing. So some of those things, whereas if you are potentially in another school with dedicated personnel who are focused on micro-credentials, quality, those kinds of things more, then it might have more steam than it would otherwise. But then there was a comment from Dawn about just suggest looking outside the US as well. So the New Zealand Qualifications Authority recognizes micro-credentials, and Canada, eCampus Ontario has established principles and frameworks for micro-credentials. The European MOOC Consortium has defined a micro-credential for its members. And then there's other, you know, certifications, ISO standards, European Qualifications Framework. So just a reminder to look outside the US for these things as well.
Yes, that's a very good suggestion, because there is a lot, I think there's been more attention to articulating the meaning of credentials in other countries. There's definitely been a lot more than, a little bit more consistency than we've been able to here. But, you know, and I think that there is an emergent discussion across different universities. There's many universities that are having this discussion about what do we do around badging, what do we do around micro-credentialing, who oversees it, how do we think about it, where does it fit in, what are the goals? What are the policies? What are the procedures? How do we make this happen? You know, and I think the interesting question that's being asked is this going to fundamentally change what universities do 20, 30 years down the road? I mean, are we going to a whole rebundling of higher ed or not? You know, or maybe what we're doing is sort of enhancing an existing system, you know, where, you know, one thing you can imagine is just that, you know, all these badges and micro-credentials are helping to make better meaning of existing degrees, helping to make them be more meaningful in the labor market and for students. But it's definitely, you know, like I said, an emerging set of discussions across many universities. And I don't know that anyone's figured it out. I mean, I think, you know, somebody in the comments brought up just the issue of language and definitions. And I think that, you know, as Heather said here, it's like the wild, wild west. It's not just the wild west, it's very, very wild, because we don't have a sort of a good common language across the board. Here, we really don't have a common language about what we're talking about. And there is a great deal of variability in terms of, you know, what universities are talking about with a micro-credential. We could be talking about something that somebody could get within a couple of hours or a couple of days versus something that might take the span of a couple of semesters. So in terms of the way we use language within this area, it's very confusing right now. And I will say that, you know, I don't know that there's a good consensus. I mean, I think we could come up with what we think the right definition is, but it's not going to reflect what's happening in the field right now, because there's so much going on and it's so different. I don't know if that helps you. I feel like we're just repeating back to you in some sense. There's this level of confusion, but you know, what there has to be is more conversations to try and get people aligned in what they're thinking about and what the goals are of these credentials and how they can help students best.
There was a question. There's a lot of banter back and forth in the chat, which is great. Clearly, you set off some hot topic issues around micro-credentials, but I think there was a question worth asking, which is when getting started, or even, you know, if you're halfway through the process, whatever, what are some of the biggest hurdles that you faced in success within micro-credentials?
So Michelle, you can certainly talk about what Rutgers is doing probably, but I can talk about the Colorado example first and the different. So there were a variety of different challenges in terms of getting things started. They didn't have a choice, which is interesting, and I think led them to move forward. Someone somewhere had written this into a very large $22 million federal grant that they got. So the Colorado Community College system had to input badges and micro-credentials. They didn't have a choice. And that meant that things moved a little faster than I think they would in a typical environment. Probably this never would have gotten going without the grant. So one thing there was putting some money behind this and putting some kind of panache behind this from the federal government program was helpful in terms of moving this idea forward. But that wasn't necessarily helpful in terms of sustainability. It got a lot of badges created. It got a lot of committees formed. There was intentionality in the grant writing to make sure that industry folks were a part of the making of those grants. So part of the making of the credentials. So the credentials were all formed in these small committees at different schools to be a part of different programs. It was chosen what they were going to be for, and different departments, in addition to manufacturing, as I showed you all, math, picked up these ideas that it would be a way to begin to communicate skills to folks. One of the reasons math folks picked up these credentials, which I think was important, and there was a lot of buy-in there, is because math is a really hard thing to equate to jobs, right? A lot of people just become actuaries or become teachers. And so thinking about how your math degree equates to other industries is really challenging. And we do a lot of work in that area. So for them, the badging idea was really helpful. And a lot of those faculty were hot to trot on it. In manufacturing, folks weren't so hot to trot on it. The faculty were really hard to get on board because they thought students would be able to demonstrate their skills, right? What did they need a badge for? They could go make something for an employer if an employer wanted them to. But then what they began to do was tie the badge to an artifact. So they had these two things together. They had the thing the student made and the badge itself. And so there was a lot of convincing that online hiring might be useful for students in manufacturing, and they might be able to get more traction from employers if they had something on a digital profile. And so those kinds of conversations had to happen. So this faculty buy-in was one of the huge pieces of this. And then the creation of the different kinds of credentials was really, in many cases, a breaking up of a syllabus. So taking these discrete skills that were a part of a syllabus, beginning to make them more applied in terms of their learning, and then offering a badge for them. And I can't speak to the rigor of those different badges, but I can say that that's how it was done in many ways. But the real challenge at the end of the day was sustainability. I don't believe these badges are still being offered at many of the colleges. Someone in the chat talked about Aurora Public Schools doing a great job with badging, and that may be true, but I think a lot of the community colleges have kind of let this go by the wayside.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to speak about what I've seen, within the university context here and then, at other places, I do think that, I mean, it's an interesting contrast where you have a grant-funded program that sort of adopted this approach versus I think what we're seeing in a lot of universities is that it's sort of organically coming up, and you see some faculty members or some particular programs or areas of the university that, find, the idea of badging to be particularly useful and relevant and helpful for students and for what they're trying to do. So you see that sort of emerging organically. And, the discussions I've seen, have really been to try and promote that sort of organic development of badges and try and educate other faculty members about what's happening, what they are, why you might want to use a badge without making it a requirement. Of course, that, certainly has concerns in that you might have a lot of variability and inequity in terms of where they're offered within the university and for who. So that's a different set of questions, but I mean, it does kind of go back to the original question that somebody brought up, around the faculty buy-in and how you incorporate that and address that concern and that issue. So, I think that you certainly I don't think you want badges to sort of be perceived by faculty as the whole thing that's going to upend higher education, which is sort of the way some commentators sort of think about this. This is going to be the unbundling of everything, and that's not necessarily how it has to be, but that seems to me to be the sort of discussion that could evoke a lot of resistance and difficulty in terms of expanding these where they are useful and helpful for students.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of three pockets of people that I've encountered, right? It's the people who think it's going to upend everything, the people who think it's going to save us, because it's going to allow students to be able to talk about those skills and provide the skills that folks think are lacking in a regular four-year degree or two-year degree, so add pieces to it. And then there's the agnostic, right, who think, why would we do this? What's the point? and getting through all of that, I think, is a real challenge. But, you know, some of the points that really moved forward in Colorado and helped were these arguments about students' own ability to talk about their skills. That had a lot of traction, even though there were sustainability issues. I think that really resonated. And another piece that I think really resonated was this idea of a momentum point. We can keep students engaged. We can keep students moving forward to finish. The college completion problem, of course, it is an issue. And then finally, the really important point is we can align our work. So our degree, our math degree, that's kind of amorphous, to industry, and help students begin to think about those careers, which maybe we haven't done as a department before. So that was some creative thinking that I saw in the Colorado project that I think could be useful.
Great, thanks Heather and Michelle. We are at 2 o'clock, so we are at time for everybody. I'm sure everybody has other meetings to get to or life things. Who knows what's going on right now? So I want to thank you both for taking the time to present to the ACRL Digital Bachelor's Interest Group. And I put the link to our LibGuide there in the chat as a reminder to go to that LibGuide. We will have the presentation will be there, and Bill and Heather, if you're willing to share your slides, we can put those there as well. So thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for the chance to share our work with you guys. It was a great discussion today. Thanks.
Take care.
So much.
Thank you.